Thanks so much. Good morning, everybody. And as you see here, the James Bond picture, this is what a lot of people in the past thought about HTTPS, in other words, encryption in transit. There was a padlock in the web browser, and all bets were off, right? It's encrypted. There's no way to actually bypass that. But in the last 5 years, if you look at what happened, since 2011, we have pretty much a vulnerability related to SSL, TLS, HTTPS coming up. We had breach, we have crime, we had beast, we had bar mitzvah, we had freak, drown, heartbleed, right? All those vulnerabilities were related to SSL, TLS, and they were, giving us all headaches because, made us think, okay, how do we implement this thing better? And if you look at the root cause for those vulnerabilities, they were related to encryption, they were related to padding, they were related to the initialization vector, a buffer overflow, and they were not related to anything related to encryption. Was really the implementation of HTTPS or TLS, if you will, right? So what I'm going to talk here is about a couple of things you can do in order to make your HTTPS implementation a little bit better, a little bit more resilient. We have only half an hour, so I'm going to really talk just about a few things. Namely, I'm going to talk about HSTS, and I'm going to talk about pinning. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about first-party cookie, which is a new setting that you can also use in your browsers. They can help you making a better system as well. And some of the tools that are out there that can help you to troubleshoot and also analyze the quality of your implementation of HTTPS. So without further ado, let's talk about HTTP strict transport security, in other words, HSTS. What is that? Well, basically, when you go and type, for example, google.com, the first thing that the browser will try to do is go HTTP google.com. And then it's going to be redirected to HTTPS, and then you get encryption. What that means? Basically, it means that the attacker has an opportunity to do a man-in-the-middle attack and put their website. Sure, the web browser will go and say, hey, it doesn't look like you're going to Google. This looks like a fake site with a self-signed certificate. Do you want to go there? How many users would actually go? Actually, 70% of the users would look at that and say, yes, I want to go to this website, regardless of what the browser is doing. So the problem here is that we're putting this type of decision to the end user to do it. And there was no way for us, the developers, to actually go and say, no, this is not good. You should not be able to move forward. So that's what HSTS does, right? It takes away that opportunity for soft fail and do a hard fail whenever something is not right with the website, when there's a man-in-the-middle DNS trickery thing going on. Right, and it also takes away this opportunity for the browser to first go HTTP and then HTTPS. You can actually go HTTPS in the first run, and we're going to look at that. In order to implement that, it's really simple. All you have to do is in your web application, put a new header, which is strict transport security, and then you put the max age, the time period that this setting is going to be valid for. And then you have other things that you can include, such as include subdomain or preload, which we're going to talk about in the next slides. So when you're implementing HSTS, the first thing that people might try is to implement this with a self-signed certificate, because it can generate, you don't have to pay for anybody, and that won't work, right? You need a real certificate in order to actually test this and do your development. Next, you also cannot use IP or even a site that is not encrypted, obviously, in order to test HSTS. And the reason you cannot do with a site that is not encrypted is because it could be used otherwise for a denial of service attack, right? In other words, somebody would inject this header and suddenly your site would no longer be available. When you do it, it will work for all ports. And should you have any problems ever, what you do is if you want to revoke the setting, you do max age equals 0.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's a very good point. You are protecting the client. You telling the client, don't do anything stupid. Don't go actually and bypass the browser telling you, hey, this is not a good site. You're probably going to be phished, right? And that's what you're doing here. So there is a directive called include subdomains, right? What this directive does is every single subdomain out there in your website would be included with this setting as well. This doesn't mean that in every single subdomain you shouldn't put this header. You actually should, because a lot of people come to your website through different ways, and you should have this directive in every single website out there. The other thing to be concerned is about NTP, in other words, the network time protocol. If somebody actually has the ability to mess up with NTP and tell you, hey, you are 6 months in the future, then this directive will expire, and then the default behavior will kick in. In other words, it will try again to go HTTP and then HTTPS. So there's still this first-time use case that we have to solve, and we're going to look at the next slide, right? You still should use secure cookies because the attacker could go, and if you don't protect every single subdomain, make up a subdomain that is not HTTPS, and then get your cookies. So let's look at the way to prevent the first use scenario from being exploited. So what you do is you preload your website into the browser. The way you do that is actually going to this site, which is HSTS preload appspot.com, and then you put your website, and then it will preload in all major browsers. A lot of people look at this and say, wow, how is this going to scale, right? If everyone's going to use, what's going to be the size of this list? Well, not our problem, but that's the way it's being done right now. It will work for Chrome, Safari, IE8, IE11, Edge, Firefox, everybody. And there's a couple of things that you have to do. One is you have to use the directive preload. You need to have a minimum of 18 weeks expiration in your HSTS. And that's pretty much what you need to do in order to use it. Very easy setting to use and highly recommended because really 70% of the users are actually bypassing that warning message that you see in the browser. The next thing I want to talk about is pinning. And I'm going to spend some time looking at how public key infrastructure works in order to understand what pinning does and what's the problem it's trying to solve. The first thing we need to understand is that there are several different certificate authorities out there, right? In this drawing here, you see certificate authorities being represented by this, blue certificate authority, green certificate authority, red, purple, and so on. There are over 100 certificate authorities out there. And what they do for you is once you claim that you have a domain, they will verify that depending on the type of certificate that you have getting. If you're just getting a regular certificate or extended validation certificate, you might have more validation going on. But basically what the certificate authority will do is validate you are who you claim to be and then provide you a certificate that they actually sign. In other words, they vouch for you that you are who you say you are. In this case, everybody here, all those servers, requested the blue certificate authority to create certificates. They were distributed, and this guy here with the big horns is evil. And he is saying, hey, I'm Google. And the certificate authority will say, hey, you're not Google. You're a phishing site. I'm not going to give you a certificate for Google, right? So the only thing that this guy can do is actually create a self-signed certificate, right, which I'm represented with another color, yellow here, and say, I am Google says I, right? That's pretty much what that certificate is saying. So when you have a client, such as a mobile app, that wants to go to a website, here's what happens. It goes to the website and gets a copy of the certificate and compares with the certificates, validates against the certificate store, which is in that mobile device. And we'll say, well, this certificate was vouched by the blue certificate authority, so it must be valid because it was validated by those guys. On the other hand, if this mobile app goes to that rogue site and looks at that self-signed certificate, it will look against the certificate store and say, well, that certificate is not, was not vouched by anybody that I trust. So I'm going to put a big warning message, and write things in red and broken padlock and so on, to show you that that certificate is not something you should be trusting, right? The problem here is that a lot of people think that only the blue certificate authority, in other words, the certificate authority that you are working with, is the one that can actually create certificates for you. And unfortunately, this is not the truth. What happens is any certificate authority can go and create a certificate on your behalf without your knowledge. And that's very important. What I'm saying here is that if the red certificate authority starts working with a foreign nation, or is breached, or decides to go rogue, they could say, well, now I want to create a certificate for Google.com, and because they are a trusted certificate authority with a certificate in the certificate store, people will actually look at the certificate as valid. In other words, if you go to that website now, and it will validate against the certificate store, we'll say, well, yeah, it's a certificate for a certificate authority that I trust, so it's vouched. So it's a big problem, especially for companies that are big like Google.
Yeah, I just saw one yesterday about somebody noticing that their DNS-only domain had certificates associated with it. And unbeknownst to them, the registrar was creating certs for every DNS-only domain registration.
Ouch.
Just leaving them sitting.
Yeah. Yeah, and this kind of attacks really happen, right? Pinning was something that came from Google when they were actually seeing foreign nations go in and create certificates for Gmail. And people were able to see all the communication that was going with Gmail. So how to solve this? That's where pinning comes in. So basically what pinning does, and here's an example of trust on first use, is that the mobile application would still go to the website, get the certificate, validate against the certificate store, see that it's valid, and say, OK, this certificate is valid. The next time that it actually goes to the website, the certificate, once it's pinned, would make the certificate store go out of the picture. In other words, you don't trust the certificate store anymore. You just use that certificate you got as the reference. So when you go to the website again, it will just compare those two certificates and say, are they the same? Or is the certificate created by the certificate authority that I trust, right? So I don't trust the green, the purple, the red certificate authority. I only trust the blue now. So the scope of the attack surface is drastically reduced by this kind of technique, right? Now, if you go back to that attack that I just showed you that actually worked, and the evil certificate authority creates a red certificate authority, a red certificate, and the mobile application gets that certificate. When it compares, it will say, well, it was not created by the blue certificate authority. It doesn't look like the certificate that I pinned, so I'm not going to trust. So you really reduce the attack surface, right? And for companies such as Google's and Facebook's and banks, this is very interesting, and they are actively implementing this kind of things. The problem is that implementing this is really a pain in the butt. I actually work for a organization that managed over 600 banks. So we had over 600 certificates that we're managing. And in order to implement this and make sure that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot, what we have to do is work with two certificates, right? So one from one certificate authority, and should the certificate authority be breached, we want another one from another certificate authority. And we want to make sure that those certificates actually don't expire at the same time, and they have some overlapping between the times that they actually are expiring, right? So suddenly the ops guys were looking at me, the security guy, and they were saying, you're crazy. Now we're going from 600 certificates to 1,200 certificates that we have to renew and we have to manage. And what if something goes wrong, Cassio? We're going to be out of business, right? Because basically this will block the communication with our service. So it's very, very risky, right? Although it's a great idea in paper, a lot of people are not implementing. In fact, I had a lot of meetings with my staff, and at the end, we decided to implement this in a different way. If you want to implement this in a web browser, it's a little bit simpler. You don't have to code things that you would do in a mobile device. And you have this header that can be used, public key pins. And then it's really similar to the HSTS header. You have a max age, and then you have the certificates that you want to pin, right? You have the SHA-256 of those certificates. And in the meantime, I was still discussing with my developers and my team how we're going to implement this until I actually read the entire RFC for the HTTP version of pinning. And I found this thing, which is the public key pin report only, which is a directive that they tell you to use when you're still implementing and you're not sure if you did things right, and you're still testing and you just want to report and have a soft fail. At some point, I talked to my developers and I said, hey, let's implement this just as report only, because we don't need 2 certificates. We don't need to do all the management that I told you before, right? And I still have a notification when things don't go right. So it's a way to implement that you don't have any risk and still have the information. And when I told that to the development team, they were like that. 1 week after, they said, yeah, let's implement. This is really easy. I will just get you the reports using JSON to a website. And should anybody ever create a rogue certificate on our behalf, we will know because it's in the report. So I found to be a much better way to implement things than actually going and trying to go all the way and have the risk of a catastrophic failure in our website, and all fingers pointing to security. The next thing I want to talk is not really related to HTTPS. However, in the past, we've seen a lot of exploits on HTTPS that would rely either on cross-site scripting or cross-site request forgery. So I think this is very, very interesting too, and it's a very new setting that people should be aware of, which is called the first-party cookie. It came out this year a couple months ago. When I proposed this talk, it was in beta, and I said, yeah, I'm still going to talk about it at LastCon, and now it's already deployed in Chrome, and you can use. So what's a first-party cookie and what's a third-party cookie? A first-party cookie is the cookie that comes from your website that you are in. So for example, let's say you are in this website, which is Harmonica Love Affair, right? And then you have a picture that you requested to that website. Whenever you request that picture, the cookie will be sent, and since it's the same site where you are in, it's a first-party cookie. Now let's talk about the like widget from Facebook. That widget is stored on Facebook. Should you be logged on Facebook, it will actually request the widget and will also provide your cookie for Facebook. And that's how Facebook knows that you're visiting, for example, the Harmonica website. And next time you go to Facebook, it will be offering you harmonicas and things like that, right? So the privacy people already figured this out and put settings in the browser in order to prevent this from happening. So it was a privacy thing until now. Now, security people look at that and said, hey, there's a way that this can be used in order to make better security as well. Consider, for example, cross-site request forgery. Pretty much, it's a third-party website that is going to have a request to your website. And should the person be logged into your website, then this request is going to work. What you do is you put this directive, which is same site equals strict, and then whenever a third-party site makes a request to your website, it won't send the cookies anymore. There are 3 flavors of the same site setting. One is normal, so it would work as it works today. One is strict, so strict pretty much would prevent cookies from going whenever you have this type of requests. And then you have lax, right? And lax is also very useful because a lot of things that if you use the strict setting, you're going to have some problems with compatibility or making your website work. If you use lax, chances are you're going to make your site work and not break any functionality, right? For example, a link on a third-party page that points to your website would still work. So very nice concession that was made with same site was to use lax and not just strict and try to be completely secure and draconian there. So the last part of this talk, I want to talk about some tools that I consider to be quite useful whenever you're doing your HTTPS TLS implementation from the ground up, or when you just want to analyze and see if you're doing a good job. I'm not affiliated with any of those companies. This is not a professional endorsement. However, I think some of those things are free and they're pretty cool. The first one I want to talk about is called Let's Encrypt. What Let's Encrypt does is it creates an automated way to issue, and renew certificates, and it does for free. Basically, you get an agent installed in your web server, and then it will actually do all the authentication of your DNS automatically, and will issue a certificate for you, and it's pretty much hassle-free. You need like 2 lines of command lines in order to make this happening. So very, very easy way to actually get a certificate in your website. And certificates are really something that people should have in every single website these days. For example, Google will get you a better page rank if you are using HTTPS. HTTP2 in some browsers are only implemented in HTTPS. iOS said that they are going to only support HTTPS starting next year. Service pages on browsers are actually only work if you use HTTPS. So a lot of things are becoming HTTPS only, and that's where the internet is going. So you should actually be using, and this is a good way to use. To be quite frank, the first use case that we had for this as a consulting company was to do phishing campaigns. And the reason was because we have requests from different customers, we have to create our domain, and it actually lower our costs in order to get the certificates because it's free, and also automated our process, right? So if we who are a legitimate company are looking at this to do phishing, imagine the bad guys, right? This is a godsend for them. So you see a lot of the bad guys actually looking at Let's Encrypt, which is a nice thing being used for evil or malicious purpose as well. The other site that has some really cool features is called Cloudflare. Cloudflare started providing CDN, and what they do is they take ownership of your DNS, and then they proxy all the communication to your website. And one thing they can do for you is they can provide you certificates and certificate management for free. So in other words, you go to their website, you give your DNS, and they ask, do you want to have HTTPS here? And you say yes. And they will have 3 ways that they can provide HTTPS for you. One is the flexible. In other words, the visitor would go to Cloudflare, and this communication would be encrypted. However, the communication from Cloudflare, which is your proxy, to your server would be unencrypted. So the user would see everything encrypted, would protect his data in that part of the communication, but not in this part. Nice thing is that Cloudflare has a lot of experts on TLS, and they're always looking at all the latest attacks, and they will manage all the ciphers for you and make sure that your site's secure. The next type of offering they have is one that you can use a self-signed certificate and make the encryption all the way from end to end, or use a certificate generated by a certificate authority and have this encryption all the way as well. So those are the 3 ways that Cloudflare can actually offer free certificates for you and do all the management. Next, we have Google Chrome, which has a debugging tool embedded in the browser that came around February, March this year. So we will tell you what kind of encryption is being used with the browser, right, and what kind of protocol, and a lot of really good information. And you have another really excellent tool, which is the SSL Labs tool. And this tool, you actually point to a HTTPS site, and will tell you whether you are vulnerable to all types of attacks, such as Heartbleed or Poodle, and so many others that came out. It will tell you how your website will work with different browsers or different mobile devices, or whether it will work at all with the configuration you have. It will also give you a grade for your implementation. So it goes from like F, which is, hey, your encryption is completely fraud, to AA+. The way to get A+, a lot of people ask, hey, how did you get AA+? Remember the HSTS that I told you in the beginning of the presentation? If you have that setting, that's the way you get A+, besides having good ciphers in your site and being able to defend against other attacks. So this is pretty much what I have for today. I hope you enjoyed. I know it was kind of a little bit rushed. I would love to hear from you.